Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. In his treatise, How a Person Can Become Aware of Their Progress in Virtue, Plutarch is going to zero in on our emotions right after he's discussed dreams. And the reason he's figuring it in there is because our emotional side and states come out in our dreams in a rather uncontrolled way unless we are in fact making progress in virtue. But what about the rest of our waking life? Can we use our emotions as an index for whether we're making moral progress to being a good, virtuous person or not? Well, so this is coming from Plutarch's Middle Platonic point of view. The Platonists, like the Aristotelians, think that the goal is not to eliminate your emotions altogether, but rather to have them in a good state where they are working with, harmonious with, subordinated to our rational faculty, which doesn't mean being totally cold and unemotional. As a matter of fact, there are some emotions that are actually signs that we're making good progress. One of these that we're going to talk about a bit more elsewhere is what he calls emulation or zelos. And we'll discuss it a little bit here. So we should imagine right at the start, we're not talking about just, getting rid of emotions altogether, but rather having the right sort. Now, how do we figure this out? How do we analyze this? He begins by saying that complete indifference would be a divine thing, but progress resembles a kind of, it's translated here as abatement and, even more important, moderation of the emotions. And so abatement, endose, and moderation, prauteti, really a calming. And usually we use this term prautes to talk about the emotion of anger. It's being calm with respect to anger. Here he's using it as sort of a general term for, making the emotions less intense. And so then he's going to say, what we need to do is to examine skopuntas. Skopein means to look into, to inquire into, to focus upon, right? It's a word that we actually get scope from, like when you're looking through, a rifle that you're going to shoot or whatever else you're going to shoot. It zeroes in on something. So that's what we're doing here. We're looking at our emotions and we're going to, he says, compare, but another way of talking about it is to judge, krinein, the word actually that we get critic from. It means to judge, to render a judgment on the differences, the diaphorai of our emotions. And so you might say, okay, well, what do you mean differences? So he's going to go on and clarify for us that there's two main, let's call them modes. And you can think of them as sort of like columns or buckets in which we place things. So we want to look at the emotions. Now it's translated here, compare our present emotions with their former selves. It doesn't actually say that in the Greek text, but you can certainly read that in. But a more literal translation would be, let's look at our emotions in themselves or in relation to themselves. Pros auta. So pros means in relation, auta themselves. So we can look at each of our emotions and say, is it more? Is it less? How is the emotion presenting itself? And we do this, as he says, with past and with the present. So we want to see if there is progress, then our present emotional state should be better than our past emotional state, right? That makes sense. If it goes the other way, then we don't have progress, we actually have regress, or we have degeneration, or something like that. The other side is in relation to each other. So pros alela, in relation, pros, alela signifies, so ala is other, and alela means each other. We've got a set of things. So we can look at each emotion by itself, and we can look at each emotion in relation to at least one other emotion. We can make comparisons between them, and we're looking for differences that have shown up. So let's look at each of these in turn. He begins by talking about the in themselves by saying we compare them with their former selves to see whether the desires, the epithumiais, so desires for sex, for food, for all sorts of things, all of these, and then we can talk about fears, phobis, and we can talk about, it's translated as, how does he have it? Angry passions. We could actually look at it as instances of anger, right? The orgais, getting angry times. So are these less intense than they were in the past? The word there is malakoterais, right? So are they actually abating to some degree? Notice he's not saying don't have any desires, don't ever get angry, don't have any fears. Maybe there's some times where we should be afraid. But are they lessening? Are they less intense than they were 2 years ago, 10 years ago, a month ago? Are you actually getting better with respect to this? And he says that if they are, it's because by using our reason, our faculty of reason, we are getting rid of the cause that kindles them. Afairuntes, we're getting rid of it. We're taking it away, the thing that tends to promote these emotions in us. So, if we are, that's good. If not, well, we need to look at that. Maybe we're not making as much progress as we think that we are. Then we can go over to the other side and look at them in relation to each other. And he says that we must compare them with one another to see whether now we are more inclined, malon is the Greek term there, to feel one emotion in place of another. So why these particular emotions? Feeling shame rather than fear. So we often think of shame as a bad thing. The ancient Greeks tended to think of it as something that it's better if you don't feel it because you didn't do anything wrong in that case. But if you did do something wrong, then you should feel a sense of shame about it. It's actually a good thing to feel that. It's a bad thing not to feel any shame over doing something wrong. And another way of translating the term here, which is aisthoito, would be having a proper sense of modesty or proportion about it. So what motivates people not to do the wrong thing? For some people who are shameless, it's just fear. I don't want to get punished. I don't want people to, shun me or something like that. If you say to yourself something like, well, I would not be able to look at myself in the mirror if I did this, that's actually better than just worrying about consequences, right? That punishments and that sort of thing. So that's a sign of progress. Here's another very, very interesting one. Emulation instead of envy. So in this case, It is zelumen, malon aisthonumen. So zelos means, we translate it as emulation. It's a word that we get zeal from, by the way. And this has a long back history. Envy, phthonos, term we're very familiar with, wanting what somebody else has, even though you don't actually deserve it, feeling pain that they have something that you don't have. Emulation is actually considered a good emotion by a lot of ancient virtue ethicists, including Aristotle, who talks about this in his work, The Art of Rhetoric, in Book 2, where he's talking about the emotions, and he says that emulation is a pain that you feel at what somebody else has, but it's because you realize that they actually do deserve it, and you don't deserve it, and you wish that you were as good as them. So when I read a really great article or book or something like that, I'm like, oh man, I wish I had written that, even though maybe I'm not capable of doing that, then I'm feeling emulation. When I see somebody up on stage playing an instrument in a way that I could never possibly do, and I feel that sense of, oh man, I wish that was me, that's emulation. If I just want to be, taking their place and having everybody cheer when I come on stage, that's not emulation, that's actually envy. So do we feel emulation in place of or instead of envy? If we do, sign that we're making moral progress. The third one is a little bit interesting in that at other places, Plutarch seems to suggest that maybe this desire for reputation or caring about reputation is not by itself a particularly good thing. So, both of these use the word philo, philodoxumen and philochemastumen. So, chrema is possessions, doxa is reputation. The desire to have a good reputation, do we have that instead of the desire for possessions or money? How do we evaluate things when we're making our decisions? How are we motivated? And, in general, it is better, even though it's not a great emotion or a great motivation, to have a desire for reputation. That's better than the desire for just possessions, right? So each of these provides us with an index by which we can compare two emotions against each other. We should, instead of doing A, do B, or feel A, or feel B. And so he says, in general, do we err by going to extremes? And he brings up, examples of going to, severity in music, the Dorian key, rather than the softness of the Lydian. And he's actually going to say that one of the things that we should look at as well is whether we're more strict than lax in our life. So if we're going to be at an extreme, let's be at the better extreme. Is it better to be like loosey-goosey and anything goes, or is it better to be strict with ourselves? To be deliberate rather than hasty in our actions and decision-making. That's a good thing, right? To be more prone to admiration, thaumazein, than to contempt for other people, to looking down on them. So with all of these, we have this in relation to each other. We substitute, by getting better, we substitute one emotion or motivation or comportment for another in our affective life. Coming back to the side of the in themselves, considering the emotions by themselves, we can say, he's going to actually go on and say, one of the first results of progress is an abatement, a lessening, you can say, of the excess and keenness of our emotions, right? So, we can ask, are we becoming more moderate in our emotions? The terms there, pathe, are the pathe becoming methistamene, established in the middle. And, this goes back to the idea of the virtuous mean. This is something that Aristotle came up with. The Middle Platonists take that in. They actually, in some other places, including in Plutarch, will say, Socrates had this idea about means. Aristotle picked it up from him. We don't have to worry too much about that. They think the Aristotelians have this right. Our emotions should be, in the middle, not too much, not too little, but just right, kind of Goldilocks. And so we can ask ourselves, are our emotions becoming less excessive? Are they becoming less intense? And the words that are being used there are actually nouns or adjectives, right? Hyperbolas, you recognize the word hyperbole coming out of that. When somebody is being hyperbolic, they're being over the top. They see something and it's cool and they're like, oh my God, this is amazing. This is the best thing ever. Well, that's hyperbole. That's excessive, right? Or something bad happens and they're like, this is a complete catastrophe. That's hyperbole. It's out of proportion. It's lacking measure. We don't want our emotions to be like that. And if we want to make moral progress, we need to get away from those. And then less intense, oxu tetas, right? So oxu means sharp, right? So like in taste, something has an oxu taste, it's sour. That sharpness that you get. So we don't want our emotions not just to go too far, we don't want them to be too intense in not flavor, but feeling as well. So if we can look at ourselves and compare where we were in the past, both in terms of the emotions, how were we feeling them before? When were we feeling them? Were we going too far with them? And then which emotions are we now feeling by comparison to past emotions? Have we replaced our less good or even bad emotions with better emotions? If we have, then we can say we are making progress and we can use that as a sign of our, grasp, our apprehension of having made moral progress.